In a gripping tale of systemic injustice, Nadia, a black FBI agent, is wrongfully targeted during a routine jog by a local officer, revealing the deep-seated racism within law enforcement. As she confronts the officer and uncovers his history of racial profiling, Nadia realizes his actions are part of a widespread culture of corruption and abuse, shielded by layers of complicity. Digging deeper, she discovers a chilling conspiracy that spans supervisors, city officials, and even the Justice Department, all working to protect a broken system that thrives on silencing marginalized voices and perpetuating inequality. The first light of dawn stretched across the sleepy suburbs as Nadia tightened her running shoes in the stillness of her home. These morning jogs had become sacred to her, a moment to exhale the pressures of life and steel herself for the challenges of her work. As a detective for the Bureau of Criminal Investigations, Nadia thrived on discipline and resilience. The rhythm of her morning runs provided her with clarity and balance. Today, however, the usual sense of calm was elusive, replaced by an unshakable unease that clung to the air. The neighborhood was unnervingly quiet. While a few early risers sipped coffee on porches or ambled with their dogs, the park, a pocket of green tranquility in the urban sprawl, felt unusually deserted. Nadia's favorite route wound through this modest park, with its neat paths, whispering trees, and grassy expanses. It wasn't just a place to exercise. It was a refuge, where she could momentarily escape the weight of her responsibilities. She was a familiar sight here, a fixture on these paths for years, but as she entered the park that morning, Nadia couldn't have foreseen the collision course she was on. What had always been her sanctuary was about to transform into a crucible. Her mind was immersed in the steady beat of her stride, the sound of her sneakers meeting pavement like a mantra, when a voice sliced through the stillness. "Hey, you stop." Startled, Nadia slowed, turning toward the sound. Approaching briskly was a stocky man in a sharp police uniform, his sunglasses low on his nose, and his expression an unreadable mix of tension and authority. His clipped tone halted her mid-step. "Why are you here?" he barked, his words like an accusation. Nadia blinked, caught off guard. "I'm jogging," she said, her voice measured. "Is there a problem?" The officer stopped a few paces from her, his presence invasive. His lips curled into a sneer. "Yeah, there's a problem. You don't belong here." The words landed with a sickening familiarity. Nadia felt her stomach tighten, the knot of frustration and defiance coiling within her. His gaze raked over her, scrutinizing her presence as if she were an intruder. She didn't need to guess the subtext behind his assertion. She had encountered this kind of presumptive disdain before. She straightened, refusing to be intimidated. "I've been coming here for years," she replied evenly. "This is a public park." His smirk deepened, a mixture of derision and condescension. "We've had reports of suspicious activity," he said, his voice dripping with implication. "And you match the description." Nadia's pulse quickened, but not from fear. Suspicious activity, that nebulous excuse, the pretext so often used to single out people who looked like her black people. "Suspicious jogging is suspicious now?" she said, her tone laced with incredulity. "Don't get smart with me." The officer took another step closer, his demeanor turning hostile. "ID now." Nadia's instincts flared. She had dealt with difficult individuals in her line of work, but this was personal. Her hand hovered over her phone. "I'll record this," she said, her voice steady but steely. She refused to let this man's aggression dictate her actions. The officer's face darkened. "You think you can play games with me?" he growled, swiping for her phone. His hand connected, and the device clattered to the pavement, its screen fracturing on impact. The sharp sound startled onlookers who had started to gather, drawn by the escalating confrontation. A murmur rippled through the small crowd, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. Nadia's heart pounded, not with fear, but with resolve. This wasn't about a phone anymore. It was about a principle, about standing up against this abuse of power. "You don't belong here," the officer roared, his voice carrying across the park. He grabbed for his handcuffs, the clink of metal, unmistakable. "You're under arrest." Nadia didn't move. Her gaze was unflinching as she reached for her jacket and pulled out her badge. The polished emblem caught the morning light, gleaming with undeniable authority. "I'm a federal agent," she said, her words slicing through the officer's bravado like a knife. and you've just made the worst mistake of your career." Time seemed to freeze. The officer stood dumbfounded, his hand frozen mid-reach. His arrogance dissolved into confusion as he stared at the badge. The murmurs in the crowd swelled, the onlookers now openly watching the fallout of this revelation. "You're—" the officer stammered, his voice cracking. "You're an agent?" Nadia didn't bother to hide her disdain. "That's right. Now tell me, what exactly about me jogging through this park looked suspicious to you?" His words caught in his throat. The confidence he had worn moments ago evaporated, leaving him fumbling for a response. The crowd's judgmental stares bore down on him, their silence louder than any accusation. "You've crossed a line," Nadia continued, her tone sharp and commanding. "You've violated my rights, and you're going to answer for it." The officer stumbled back, his face pale. I didn't know that I was an agent," Nadia interrupted, her voice rising. "Does it matter? You didn't know anything about me, but you decided I didn't belong here. That's all you needed to justify this." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth. The officer looked around helplessly, his gaze skimming over the crowd, searching for an exit from the hole he had dug. The spectators, silent until now, began whispering amongst themselves. A woman holding a dog leash stepped forward slightly, her eyes locked on Nadia. "We saw what happened," she said firmly. "That wasn't right." The officer's shoulders sagged under the weight of their collective condemnation. He looked back at Nadia, his face a mixture of anger and humiliation. But he had no power left to wield. Nadia's grip on her badge tightened. She had no intention of letting this slide. This was more than a personal slight. It was a symptom of a larger disease. This moment was a crack in the armor of systemic injustice, and she would make sure it widened. "You'll be hearing from me," she said coldly, stepping past him and retrieving her shattered phone. She turned to the crowd, her gaze sweeping over the onlookers. "Remember what you've seen here today. Silence only enables this kind of abuse." And with that, she walked away, her stride steady and unyielding. The officer stood frozen, his world unraveling. For Nadia, this was just the beginning. This moment would ignite a fight far larger than a confrontation in a park. A fight for accountability, for justice, and for change. "I'm a black woman who doesn't fit your narrow idea of who belongs here." Nadia's words rang out like a sharp bell, cutting through the officer's defenses. The truth in her voice was undeniable, leaving him visibly shaken. His bravado melted away, replaced by the weight of his actions. There was no retort, no justification, just the suffocating silence of a man exposed by his own prejudice. The small crowd that had gathered around the scene shifted uncomfortably, their gazes bouncing between Nadia and the officer. Some whispered to one another, hesitant to intervene, while others simply watched, their expressions a mix of curiosity and unease. Authority, once an unyielding force in the officer's posture, now crumbled under the sheer gravity of the moment. Nadia had flipped the dynamic, reclaiming power with unwavering composure. She didn't need to argue further. Her silence spoke volumes. She was no longer just a jogger or a target of discrimination. She was a force to be reckoned with. The officer was no longer the confident enforcer he had been moments ago. Stripped of his authority in the eyes of the onlookers, he was just a man grappling with his failure. "I need you to leave," Nadia said, her voice firm, every syllable laced with authority. The officer hesitated, looking around for an ally, or an escape. None came. His gaze flicked back to Nadia's badge, its polished surface catching the light. With a final glance at her, he turned and trudged away, his shoulders slumped and his head down. The power he had once wielded over her evaporated, leaving only the cold realization of his mistake. As the officer disappeared down the path, Nadia remained rooted, her heart hammering in her chest. But this wasn't fear, it was resolve. This confrontation wasn't just about her morning run. It symbolized a larger battle, one that had been waged for generations. She had stood her ground, and in doing so, she had exposed an injustice that could no longer be ignored. When the last echoes of the officer's retreat faded, Nadia bent to retrieve her broken phone. Its shattered screen mirrored the fragility of the moment, but she knew its contents were intact. The evidence of the encounter, recorded in shaky yet undeniable clarity, was her weapon. It would amplify her voice and shine a light on what so many experienced in silence. The murmurs of the dispersing crowd faded into the quiet of the park. Nadia held her phone's fragmented pieces in her hands, her mind racing. This was no longer just about a single encounter. It was about a system that allowed prejudice to fester unchecked. A system that gave people like that officer the power to abuse their authority without consequence. Nadia knew the fight ahead would not be easy. This wasn't the first time she had been profiled, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time, she had the means to push back, to force accountability. Her badge gave her a unique leverage, and she intended to wield it for more than her own vindication. This wasn't just personal. It was about change. Leaving the park, Nadia's steps were purposeful, her resolve hardening with each stride. She thought of the countless others who had faced the same humiliation and injustice, their voices silenced or dismissed. Not this time. She wouldn't let this encounter fade into obscurity. That afternoon, Nadia sat in her office, surrounded by the controlled chaos of her department. Phones rang incessantly, printers hummed with life, and colleagues bustled past her desk, engrossed in their own assignments. But none of it registered. Her mind was fixed on the events of the morning and the path she needed to carve forward. She picked up the phone and dialed Ethan, a trusted colleague in internal affairs. Ethan was one of the few people she knew who would approach this with integrity. "Hey, Nadia," he answered, his tone warm but cautious. "What's going on? You okay?" "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice carried a weight that hinted otherwise. "But I need your help. Something happened this morning. It's serious." "All right," Ethan said after a brief pause. "I'm listening." Nadia recounted the events in detail. The officer's approach, his baseless accusations, and the way he had escalated the situation. She described the shattered phone and the witnesses who had seen everything. As she spoke, Ethan remained silent, absorbing the gravity of her words. "This isn't just about one bad cop," Nadia concluded, her voice steady but resolute. "It's about a culture that enables people like him to operate without accountability. I need you to help me dig into his history complaints, incidents, anything that sheds light on his behavior." Ethan sighed, the sound heavy with understanding. "I'll start looking into it," he said. "But you know how these things go. If he's been protected by the system, we're going to face a lot of resistance." "I'm not afraid," Nadia replied, her conviction unshaken. "This has to stop." For the next few days, Nadia worked tirelessly. She salvaged the recordings from her damaged phone, piecing together every moment of the confrontation. The footage was raw and difficult to watch, but it was undeniable. It captured not only the officer's actions, but also the larger truth of his prejudice. Meanwhile, Ethan's investigation uncovered a troubling pattern. The officer had a history of complaints, accusations of racial profiling, aggressive behavior, and even excessive force. Yet, like so many before him, he had faced no real consequences. The complaints had been dismissed as isolated incidents, swept under the rug to protect the department's reputation. This time, however, there would be no sweeping. Nadia was determined to bring the truth to light, no matter the obstacles. Each piece of evidence, each witness statement, became a brick in the case she was building, a case not just against the officer but against the system that had enabled him. Nadia sat back in her chair, her eyes fixed on the scattered files and notes covering her desk. Her exhaustion was palpable, but so was her determination. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been silenced, for every unjust act that had been buried. The confrontation in the park had ignited something within her, a fire that burned brighter with each passing day. She had seen too much, endured too much, to let this go. And now, with the truth in her hands and allies at her side, she was ready to make her stand. This was only the beginning. The fight for justice was far from over, but Nadia was prepared for the long road ahead. She would not rest until the system that allowed this injustice to thrive was held accountable. The reckoning had begun. Nadia knew she couldn't approach this battle recklessly. Officer Jason Pierce's actions weren't an isolated case of misconduct. They were emblematic of a larger, deeply ingrained culture within law enforcement. The same system that empowered him to act without consequence also silenced those who dared to speak out. But Nadia wasn't just going to bring down one bad officer. She intended to expose the rot that protected and perpetuated this behavior. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for systemic accountability. The days blurred into nights as Nadia buried herself in her work. The incident in the park had gone viral, sparking a national conversation about racial profiling, and the unchecked authority of law enforcement news outlets dissected every angle of the story, while hashtags calling for reform trended on social media. But Nadia knew the spectacle wasn't the point. The confrontation in the park was just the tip of the iceberg. The true challenge lay beneath the surface, in the institutional layers that allowed these injustices to persist. As Nadia delved deeper into Pierce's history, an alarming pattern emerged. The officer had been the subject of multiple complaints, ranging from racial profiling to excessive use of force, but each incident had been quietly dismissed. Internal investigations ended inconclusively, with no action taken against him. Witnesses and complainants were discredited, and whistleblowers within the department were silenced through intimidation or retaliation. This wasn't new to Nadia. She had seen similar patterns during her time as an agent, but confronting it so directly was different. It was personal now. The further she looked, the clearer it became. Pierce wasn't an anomaly. He was a symptom of a system designed to shield its own, prioritizing loyalty and image over justice. Nadia's nights were spent piecing together the puzzle: reports, testimonies, emails, and internal memos. One evening, her inbox pinged with an anonymous message. Attached were heavily redacted files containing damning evidence, transcripts of complaints, internal emails, strategizing cover-ups, and even recordings of conversations implicating not just Pierce, but other officers and high-ranking officials in the department. She sat frozen as she read the documents. They detailed a pervasive culture of silence, where officers who challenged misconduct were ostracized, threatened, or reassigned. Civilians who filed complaints were dismissed as unreliable, their concerns buried under bureaucratic excuses. The truth wasn't just buried, it was actively suppressed. With every new discovery, Nadia's resolve deepened, but she also knew the risks she faced. The deeper she dug, the more enemies she would make. She needed help. Her first call was to Ethan. Ethan had already begun his own investigation into Pierce's behavior. Together, they reviewed the new evidence and strategized. They weren't just dealing with a rogue officer. They were confronting a system that had been allowed to fester for decades. "We're walking a fine line," Ethan warned, his voice low. "If we go public, they'll throw everything they have at us. They'll discredit you, bury the evidence, and make you the villain." Nadia nodded, her face set with grim determination. "I know. But if we don't do this, nothing changes. People like Pierce will keep getting away with it." Ethan hesitated. "I've spoken to some of Pierce's former colleagues. A few are willing to testify, but they're scared. They know what happens to people who speak out." "They need to know they're not alone," Nadia said firmly. "We need to show them that standing up to this system is worth it." Nadia spent hours reaching out to potential allies within the department. Officers who had worked with Pierce, former investigators who had seen the corruption firsthand, and even civilians who had filed complaints in the past. Many were reluctant, their fear palpable, but a few were willing to take the risk. One former officer revealed how Pierce's misconduct had been brushed aside time and time again. "They called it protecting the badge," he said bitterly. "It wasn't about justice. It was about making sure the department looked good. Anyone who tried to fight it was pushed out." Another whistleblower, a civilian employee, shared chilling details about a meeting where senior officers discussed how to discredit complainants. "They knew exactly what they were doing," she said. "It wasn't incompetence, it was calculated." These testimonies, combined with the documents Nadia had received, painted a damning picture. This wasn't just about Pierce. It was about a system that valued its own survival over the safety and dignity of the people it claimed to serve. The closer Nadia got to the truth, the more resistance she faced. Anonymous threats began trickling in. Veiled warnings to back off files she needed for her investigation suddenly became unavailable. Even some of her colleagues in the bureau started treating her with suspicion. Ethan was right. The system was fighting back. "They're scared," Ethan said during one of their late-night calls. "They know you're onto something big." "And that's why we can't stop," Nadia replied. "If we let them silence us, we're complicit." But the pressure weighed on her. She felt it in the suspicious glances from colleagues, the curt emails from superiors, the growing sense of isolation. Still, she pressed on. The weight of every silenced voice, every victim of injustice, pushed her forward. As Nadia's investigation progressed, the case took on a life of its own. Media coverage intensified, as leaked documents and whistleblower testimonies began circulating. Public outcry grew louder, with protests demanding transparency and reform. But Nadia knew the fight wasn't just in the streets. It was in the boardrooms, the precincts, and the courts. Change wouldn't come from hashtags or headlines. It would come from dismantling the structures that allowed this corruption to flourish. She prepared for the next step, presenting her findings to the Bureau and seeking federal oversight of the local department. It was a bold move, one that could cost her career if it failed. But Nadia wasn't fighting for her career. She was fighting for justice. As she picked up the phone to make her next call, her hand trembled slightly. She knew the road ahead would be long and fraught with danger, but she also knew she wasn't walking it alone. Allies like Ethan, the whistleblowers, and the growing wave of public support gave her hope. This wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for every person who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or oppressed. It was a fight for accountability, for change, and for the future. And Nadia wasn't backing down. The reckoning was far from over. It was only just beginning. Nadia sat at her desk, her eyes scanning the piles of documents, each one heavier with meaning than the last. This wasn't just about Officer Pierce. The deeper she and Ethan dug, the clearer it became. This was an entire network, a web of corruption that stretched through every layer of law enforcement and into the halls of power. From supervisors who buried complaints to political figures who ignored glaring issues, the system had been meticulously designed to protect itself at the expense of the people it was supposed to serve. Ethan, her steadfast ally, had been her rock through this relentless investigation. They worked side by side, often late into the night, piecing together the threads of Pierce's misconduct and the culture that enabled him. Every revelation brought a mix of triumph and dread. Pierce's actions weren't unique. They were emblematic of a much larger, systemic rot. Nadia knew this was no longer just an investigation. It was a battle for the soul of justice. The tension broke when Nadia's phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Ethan. "We've got a lead. Meet me in 20. Her heart quickened. Every lead they'd uncovered had pulled them deeper into this labyrinth of corruption, and every step forward brought them closer to a line they couldn't uncross. At the Internal Affairs office, Ethan's face was grim as she entered. He pushed a stack of papers across the desk. "You need to see this," he said, his voice low. Nadia flipped through the documents, her stomach twisting as she read. The emails were damning. Officers, including Pierce, had been coordinating the harassment and profiling of specific individuals in the community. The targets, chosen because of their race or background, had been systematically treated like criminals. The conversations were vile, explicit, and deliberate. "Do you think this goes higher?" Nadia asked, though she already knew the answer. It always did. Ethan nodded, his jaw tight. These emails weren't just between Pierce and his buddies. There's evidence suggesting involvement from supervisors and even some city officials. If we're going to take this down, we need to prove how far it goes. The weight of it settled over Nadia. This wasn't just about holding one officer accountable. It was about dismantling a system that had been engineered to protect itself. Nadia and Ethan worked tirelessly, reviewing every piece of evidence, following every lead. Whistleblowers came forward cautiously, their fear palpable. Some had seen Pierce's behavior firsthand, while others spoke of a culture of retaliation that silenced dissent. One former officer's testimony was chilling. "You didn't challenge the system. If you did, you were reassigned or pushed out. Pierce was just the face of it. There are dozens like him." The truth was undeniable, and the pieces of their case were coming together. But with every step forward, the risk grew. Then came the discovery that made Nadia's blood run cold. There was a leak. Someone in the department was feeding information to the very people she and Ethan were investigating. "They know what we're doing," Ethan told her late one night. "And they're preparing to fight back." Nadia exhaled, her resolve hardening. "Then we make sure they don't see our next move coming." The growing public pressure was impossible to ignore. The viral story of the park confrontation had spiraled into something larger. People were demanding transparency, accountability, and answers. But Nadia knew the system wouldn't give up without a fight. The leak meant they were running out of time. Ethan voiced his concern as they reviewed their next steps. If we take this to the Justice Department, there's no going back. They'll know exactly who's behind this. That's the point, Nadia replied, her voice resolute. We've come too far to let this slip through the cracks. If we don't act now, they'll bury it, just like they've buried everything else. Ethan hesitated, then nodded. All right, let's do it. But we need to be careful. One wrong move, and this all falls apart. Nadia reached out to an old friend at the Justice Department, Avery Grant, a seasoned investigator known for tackling tough cases. If anyone could help, it was him. When Nadia arrived at Avery's office, the urgency in his expression was unmistakable. This is bigger than we thought, he said, motioning for her to sit. The documents you sent me. This goes straight to the top city officials, department heads, even a few names within the Justice Department. This isn't just corruption, it's a conspiracy. Nadia's stomach churned. She had suspected this, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. The people they were up against weren't just bad actors. They were powerful, connected, and prepared to do whatever it took to protect themselves. There's something else, Avery continued. We've traced the leak someone high up is feeding information to the people we're investigating. If this gets out before we're ready, it could ruin everything. Nadia leaned forward, her voice cold. Do you know who? We're still tracking it, Avery admitted. But we're running out of time. Nadia and Ethan worked with Avery to finalize their case. Every detail had to be airtight. They compiled reports, testimonies, recordings, and the damning emails into a comprehensive dossier. The goal was clear: force a federal investigation into the department and expose the web of corruption. But as they neared their final steps, the stakes rose. Anonymous threats started trickling in, and Nadia was forced to move cautiously, frequently changing locations. The pressure was suffocating, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. When the time came to submit their findings, Avery called Nadia. It's happening. We're making our move, but you need to be ready for the fallout. I'm ready, Nadia replied without hesitation. Let's finish this. The day the dossier was released, it shook the city. The media exploded with coverage. The evidence too overwhelming to dismiss names were named, and the public's outrage was deafening. Protests erupted, demanding resignations, criminal charges, and systemic reform. But the battle was far from over. Nadia knew the system would fight back, using every tool at its disposal to protect itself. The corruption they had exposed wasn't just about individuals. It was about an entire institution, built on secrecy and self-preservation. Nadia stood in her apartment that night, looking out at the city. She felt a strange mix of exhaustion and hope. The fight was only just beginning, but for the first time, there was a chance for real change. The system had underestimated her resolve. It thought it could silence her. But Nadia wasn't just one voice. She was part of a movement, a reckoning that could no longer be ignored. As she prepared for the battles ahead, she knew one thing for certain. The truth was out, and no one could bury it again.